Hello, everyone, and welcome to our Reframing Assessment to Center Equity author webinar. My name is Patty Webb, and I am the Marketing Manager for Stylus Publishing. Stylus webinars bring you direct access to our authors and their latest titles. I'm happy to introduce Gavin Henning, Natasha Jankowski, Eric Montenegro, all co-editors of Reframing Assessment to Center Equity, Theories, Models, and Practices. Joining them will be chapter authors Divya Beta, Eunice Brick, Marilee Bresciani-Ludwig, and Verna Orr. The intersection of equity and assessment is one of the most important, consequential, and hot topics in assessment practice. In this webinar, our authors will discuss an overview of the book and its chapters, introduce key concepts related to equity-centered assessment, share exemplars of equity-centered assessment in action, and provide future directions for assessment with equity at the center. Thank you all for joining us today. So let's start with Natasha Jankowski.
Thanks so much, Patty. And thank you all for joining us and being here and signing up and participating in a conversation about equity and assessment. I am going to share with you a picture. Let me put this up so you can see of all the wonderful people that were part of this process in this book. And so we would not be here, but we do have some of our chapter authors, and we are so grateful for your participation and talking in this. This would not be the book that it is, or I think the balance across the view of what we tried to do in this book without all of the different people that were participating. And so huge thank you and shout out to each of them. So what we're going to do today is we're going to go over the book, but we're going to do it by introducing sections. So I'll give you a kind of high level overview of how the book is set up and why we did this book, what that's about. Then we'll go into these sections. We'll have one of our editors sort of introduce and think about it, and then we'll have a chapter author engage in discussion about a deeper dive into that space, so you can get kind of a nice sampling across the different pieces of the book. So when I think about why this book, and why now, there are so many great conversations that have been happening in different spaces in different pockets, whether it was in student affairs, whether it was an assessment, whether it was an evaluation, on thinking about the intersection of assessment and equity. And one of the things that we really wanted to do, and I think tried to do in this book, and it's the start of a conversation, was to bring those different groups into dialogue with one another and put together a place that you can come to sort of catch up on where are all these different conversations, what are people talking about, how are they relating to each other, and then what does that mean for practice. So also, I would say the timing of this, and huge thank you again to all of these chapter authors, is in the midst of a pandemic when the importance of equity and assessment was paramount, but everyone was stressed and dealing with all sorts of things. People wrote book chapters. and these are also some of the people that were doing this work of equity and assessment, which also means most likely you don't have the time to write a book chapter. And so huge thank you to everyone who participated in this, who went with us on this journey in the process to get all of this information together. So how this book is structured is it is set up into 4 different sections. And so we'll have each of the editors kind of go over what each of those sections mean, and then the chapter authors do the deeper dive. And the first is why. Why do we need to think about assessment and equity? And that also provides a nice history, and there's about 3 chapters in that. The second is what. So if we've got like why this is, what the heck are we talking about? Which does some literature and models and nice overview. Think about this as the sections of chapters you can use in a class. Really would be a really helpful way to think. And then how do you do this work? So the next section, there are about 9 chapters about how do you actually implement this and do this in different areas, whether it's student affairs, whether it's in the classroom, however that may be. And then it ends with a section on now what. So you've done this, where do we go from here? How do we think about the next steps in this conversation and the profession? So very excited to get this to you. Please think as you're not only participating in this webinar with us, but also the part of this larger conversation. So you to engage in chat and ask questions and dialogue. It's you who will carry this work forward and engage in these conversations and move it. We hope this is a helpful resource to you. But on that, I will stop the share here and turn it into our first section. So Gavin, I believe it's over to you.
Yeah, so I want to make sure we also acknowledge our 2 other co-editors who could not be here, Janina Baker and Ann Lundquist. So they were also pivotal in making this book work. So we'll start with Eric Montenegro, give an overview of section 1.
Yeah, thank you, Gavin. Section 1. So when we conceptualized this book, we wanted to be mindful that not everyone who's an assessment practitioner is well-versed, experienced, or comfortable with approaching their work through an equity lens. So this section is brief but mighty. It is made up of the first 3 chapters, like Natasha mentioned. They guide you through a fundamental understanding of the intersection between equity and assessment, why equity and assessment is both important and necessary, and it gives us the opportunity to reflect on the history of these terms. In this section, you will also find a chapter authored by our next speaker who will share a bit more about what it means to do this work as an activist and as an ally through a very important call to action. So I'm very happy to pass it off to Divya.
Thank you, Eric. Hi, everyone. So I'll just very briefly share a little bit about the chapter that I had the good fortune to contribute to this body of work. So I call, I think, everyone who participates in this kind of work, in equity building work, I call on all of us to be activists, right? Whether we acknowledge it overtly or whether we are passionate about it and it doesn't feel like a safe space to call it out, but we engage in the work. And so I talk about what it means to be an activist, kind of explaining, building that community, intentionally organizing, intentionally finding like-minded people so that then you can organize, you can plan. And a lot of us today seem to, me included at times, where we are overwhelmed or we too much is coming at us in terms of a fire hose, in terms of things, the actions that we need to take, that we then start thinking, okay, I can't do much. So we engage in armchair activism, right? And so there's a lot of literature in the social justice world, a lot of women of color scholars who've talked about acting out of love. The idea that when you're passionate about something, when you care about something, you actually engage in action towards that. It's not just sitting and saying, I care about the environment or I care about equity. It means that you follow up and you follow through on what you're committed to. So the why of the chapter, so there are 5 things that I talk about, where it's own your activism, understand that we will make mistakes. So you'll take 5 steps forward, then like peeling an onion, there will be a lot of pain, and then you realize you need to do it differently because what you thought would help you achieve equity was not the right way. And so you need to take a step back, right? And then do it again. So it's a recursive process. Build your community so that you have people who can hold you accountable. I talk about all of that. But the foundation also to this chapter is, speaking to the why, is that equity, social justice is the foundation, right? So you can either you can work towards equity through assessment. By having sound assessment practices, you can advance equity as a goal, where you build a better, university program, student experience environment. So the goal is equity, and you're achieving that through assessment, whether it's a program evaluation, whether it's a needs assessment, whether it's classroom student outcomes learning assessment, where you're saying, oh, wow, there's a group of students who are consistently not performing, and that's a function of our poor curriculum or a poor teaching, and we need to adjust that. So that's one way of looking at it, where we are achieving it as a goal. The other way of looking at it is, in our assessment practices, are we making sure that they are equitable? And so looking at assessment and the equity of our practices. So assessment in equity, or assessment, equity through assessment, or equity in assessment. And it's both and. And so that's the case that I make, that it needs to be both. And so foundational to all of that is us consistently keeping track of all the literature and scholarship and the research out there around social justice issues, understanding how, we all say, are we woke enough? And it's not about being woke enough, it's about understanding how language is being used and co-opted in ways that are oppressive. And so what new language do we have to adopt? What new ways of being do we have to adopt? So that's just a little bit about the why. So the center of it all still is equity, which speaks to the title of the book.
Thanks, Divya. So now we'll move over to part 2, and I actually get to be the editor, provide the overview, as well as an author. So section 2 is really about that foundational element. So we talk a little bit about some of the scholarship, which to me was really surprising because it goes all the way back to the 1930s. There's a whole host of literature and scholarship around this topic, most of which comes from the evaluation field. We also have a chapter on the varied roles of narratives and stories in assessment. There's a great chapter on models and approaches, which gives, I think, a broader sense of what this could look like, where in part 3 will be some specific examples, and then the various lenses that could be used for equity-centered assessment. So I'll talk a little bit about the chapter I co-wrote with Janina Baker on the scholarship. And so we really examined all the scholarship related to anything related to equity, assessment, and evaluation. And some of the topics that came up in our literature review were anti-racist assessment, a bias-free assessment, critical assessment, culturally responsive assessment, decolonizing indigenous assessment, deconstructed assessment, so socially just assessment, feminist assessment, healing-centered assessment, mindfulness assessment. And that's just some of them. There are a lot more. And so our goal with that chapter is to provide an overview and a foundation about how not only what the different topics are, how they're nuanced, but what is the evolution chronologically of that? So that's really an interesting trend to see how that has gone on, as I said, back from the 1930s, and then kind of jumped ahead to the 1970s, and there's been a lot of work since then. And so check out that chapter for a little bit of background. And then in part 3, this is really, I think, the biggest useful chunk of that whole book. This is the how, because people are always asking, how do you do this work? What does it look like in practice? And these, we have some fantastic chapter authors and co-authors who discuss assessment, equity-centered assessment in class meetings, culturally relevant assessment to study equity gaps, culturally responsive assessment through faculty and student voices, needs for equity-minded assessment and evaluation outside the classroom. There's actually a case study for advancing equity through student affairs assessment practice. Another chapter on assessing equitable access in STEM fields, one on equitable assessment in community colleges. And then the final chapter in this part is cultural awareness and practice through teaching and learning at HBCUs. And we're really excited to have Eunice here to talk about a chapter which was really fantastic to me, because I hadn't really thought about it, is the connection to the land. And it was really enlightening for me. So I'll let Eunice talk a little bit about her chapter.
Thank you so much, Gavin. Good morning from Honolulu, everybody. My name is Eunice Leung Brecky. I am a professor of sociology at Libre Community College, and I'm just one of the co-authors of the chapter that's titled Centering aina in Assessment, Striving for Equity and Social Justice, which is in the How section. So let's start off with what aina means. It is a Hawaiian word, and it can be translated as land, place, sky, and sea. So the authors and I are motivated from several sources. First, from an assessment perspective, it's our belief that good assessment uses assignments or other tasks that benefit both students and faculty. Okay. Second, students' motivation to do well matters, and thus assignments or any assessment instruments need to resonate with the students. And finally, our chapter is motivated by a deep sense of responsibility to the place or the aina where the campuses are located. And this necessarily includes the indigenous people of Hawaii and addressing colonization. So with that in mind, let me briefly describe, outline the chapter and finish with what we hope as readers will gain by it. Our chapter opens with what connects the authors actually. We are connected by living on the same island, and we recognize our kuleana, or our responsibility and privilege to give back and care for the aina, which includes the place and people. We touch upon the social justice issues related to the colonization of Hawaii and the illegal overthrow of the Hawaiian Kingdom. We explain that colonization and racism have created a disconnect for most of us, Native Hawaiian and non-Native Hawaiian. We are disconnected from the aina, from place, and from each other. So, education and assessment, what can it do? All right. It can help diminish or remove that disconnection. We need to rebuild. So for example, instead of learning outcomes or assessment being generic, we describe how assessment can be grounded in aina to promote equity. In Hawaii, and arguably anywhere, it is beneficial, equity-minded practice to recognize and incorporate indigenous knowledge systems, people, and the land upon which we teach and learn in assessment instruments and assignments. In Hawaii, research has shown that centering on aina leads to improved outcomes for Native Hawaiians. Preliminary research indicates that both Native Hawaiian and non-Native Hawaiian students and faculty benefit. Sorry, I actually have a script to represent the many strong authors, okay? So I don't want to mess them up. Okay. In Hawaii, research has shown that centering on aina leads to improved outcomes for Native Hawaiians. The majority of our chapters is actually in 4 examples. 2 are from community colleges and 2 from the research institution, which is basically University of Hawaii Manoa. Okay. In my section, I explain how I designed a Social 100 level course on the sociology of food in partnership with a local farm, which is behind me. Those are my students, okay? I write about a particular assignment that asks students to draw from their ancestral knowledge of food systems and practices. Monique Chiba, professor of mathematics, describes the importance of connecting math to cultural knowledge and land. She has described her and her department's revision of Math 100 to include this practice, using aina-based math assignments. Charmaine Mangrum of the College of Education's Teacher Ed program details her course, how her course contributes to program learning outcomes on place and social justice. She uses a sequence of signature assignments related to issues of equity, diversity, access, and power and privilege in local schools and communities. It's a really good one, okay. Our last example comes from Kara Wagner. Kara is from Kapilani Community College, and they created a comprehensive rubric on aina-based learning to be used across disciplines. She describes the process from gathering the team to distributing the rubric. She also provides a rubric excerpt on community engagement. Phew, okay, so when you finish reading our chapter, we hope that we sparked some ideas that you'll be able to use new ways of thinking about equity and assessment, specifically on how assessment instruments or assignments can help address equity and social justice, if they have a perspective of place and the histories of the place where the institution or where the students are located. So yes, you can do this in Peoria, you can do it in Nashville, you can do it in New Orleans, because in Hawaii and elsewhere, the aina that nourishes us and what we have responsibility to care for teaches us, can reconnect us, and helps us address equity and social justice. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Eunice. That chapter was really fantastic. It's probably one of my favorite in the book.
We had a great editor.
Thanks so much, Eunice. So Natasha's going to talk about the final section, which is the now what. So I'll pass it over to her.
Thank you so much. And I am loving this webinar. This is such a great glimpse, and it's like celebration into just the richness of the conversations, the wide variety of perspectives. And I think it was such a lovely mirror in engaging in this work to see back to us when we say there are so many ways to go about doing assessment. And there are so many ways to be equitable in assessment or achieve equity through assessment. We saw that throughout all the different ways that the authors brought to bear their experience and the ways in which they're engaging in these conversations. And so, to Divya's point, when she's saying about how do you start to be an ally, it was there are so many opportunities and roads in and ways to think differently about practice, whether assignments and all these places to shift a lens, to start to see this, which then leads to other lens shifts and other lens shifts. So I'm cheesing out over here. I'm so excited. This is so great to participate in. So in the last section of the book, after, there's all of this wealth of information and ideas, resources, we really wanted to do a pass to say, okay, great. Now what? You can read all of this, but what are you going to do? And how are we going to think differently about this work? And so in the now what section, there are 3 chapters. One that's thinking about the role of technology and how do we need to think about that playing out. One that thinks about what do we need to be doing ourselves from a perspective of individual that Mary Lee will talk about in just a moment. And the last one is really saying, please don't take this book as your comprehensive tome of how to do equity and assessment, but that this is the beginning of a conversation and that we can find more examples to do this. And it's actually set up as a dialogue, as in the conversations of the authors that we're doing it, to really mirror the ways that we hope that this starts conversations and with each other and thinking about how to do this work differently. So I want to pass to Mary Lee to share her, and that's the best camera on I have ever seen. Mary Lee, over to you.
Thank you. I apologize. Well, I don't apologize for my background. It's beautiful. If I turned around, you'd see the ocean. So good morning from California. As I was working with my San Diego State colleagues, and we had a little technical difficulty, so I went outside. I hope the background noise isn't bad, but it's probably a very appropriate setting to be discussing developing individual awareness with my co-workers who are here with me in spirit, Danielle and Anne. And this book, we're honored to be able to contribute. So thank you for this time as well. In this book, we begin by explaining a little bit of neuroscience into the realization that as cognitively well-informed we may be, and how well the book has prepared us to this point to be cognitively well-informed. What our practice is becoming individually aware of what trips us up as we move forward to implement these wise practices. So in this chapter, we're starting off with, while we think we can be objective, the reality is that our individual lived identities are influencing how we see the data and the questions we ask. So the invitation is for us as individual assessors to begin the work from the inside, so that as we also do the work on the outside, it will be less performative and very real and authentic. So in this chapter, what we do is invite ourselves and those we practice assessment with to deepen our awareness through some particular practices around the assessment cycle. So there are questions that we offer at each step of the awareness cycle that will invite in a pausing. And we're also inviting in a pause long enough so that you can tap into ancestral awareness, ancestral wisdom, and also just the wisdom of emotions in the body. So there's so many times when we're working with assessment that a question might be asked about the data, the collection of the data, or even a learning outcome. And assessment professionals will notice, like, maybe the hair on the back of their neck stands up, or they get an uncomfortable ease in the chest or the stomach, yet they don't act on that. And so, back to Divia's point, if we really are in love with each other, really deeply in love with each other, and really want the best for our students and our colleagues, whether they're faculty or professional practitioners, that we'll take the pause and we'll move very skillfully in action to offer a question into the group and invite the group to pause and begin to open up space for us all to recognize how our privileges and our lived experiences of our identities are feeding into the interpretation at every step of the assessment cycle. We also offer some practices for what is called self-compassion. And compassion in a neuroscience perspective has 4 parts. It's a feeling for, understanding of, a motivation to alleviate any pain and suffering that may be present, but not in a like a rescuing way, but in a co-creation and dialogue of resolution. And then that moves to action. And so the premise of this chapter is that awareness, inner awareness, can breed wise action. And that wise action can cause us, provide us with strength to also restore justice when assessment data has been used to further marginalize human beings and their experiences. And also to give us a courage to act out in ways that might need to be present in disruptive behaviors or in other forms of just, again, stopping an assessment process, for instance, pausing it. And the hope is that we will move toward restorative action in a compassionate way, but also practice that toward ourselves when we mess up, so we can get right back in there and keep working.
Great. Thanks, Marilyn.
Thank you.
And what I appreciated about the chapter that Marilyn co-authored is it not only made me think and reflect about how I do assessment work, but just how I do any kind of work. And so really thinking about my positionality, how that impacts everything I do, from teaching to learning to assessment. So it's there's a broad application from that chapter. And we really think there's something in this book for everybody. If you're new to assessment, there's stuff here. If you're new to equity and assessment, there's stuff here. If you've been doing assessment for a long time, there's stuff here. If you've been doing even some equity related assessment, either equity minded or equity centered assessment, there are probably some new nuggets of wisdom that you can take away from this. We think it's helpful for practitioners. scholars, researchers, because there's a little bit of everything, and even graduate students. And so I think there's it's definitely applicable to wide audiences, regardless of what folks bring to this. Well, we really wanted to just give you a quick overview, but provide opportunity for folks to ask questions about the book. So feel free to drop in any questions that you have into the Q&A, into the chat, or raise your hand and we can unmute. I'll also invite any of the other co-authors or co-editors if there's anything else you want to add while we're waiting for folks to post questions.
You know, I got comments, so I would love to add one piece to this on the thing that I think hopefully this larger conversation and this overview really signals is that part of what this book does is it bridges the intersection between dialogue on these topics and practice, and really puts that together. And while we were trying to think about, you know, what all do we put in, I mean, Gavin and Janina's landscape overview of all of these pieces was, it can be, there's so much, but how do we think about where we sit in intersecting this together from the conversations that we're having on equity and what we are doing in our daily practice around assessment, and the various ways that people were thinking about that intersection between this larger dialogue and the practice, I think is just a wonderful thing to see. So thank you for showcasing that so well, fellow authors.
Thanks, Natasha. So one of the questions is, do any of the chapters address restorative justice as abolition and evaluation? Unfortunately, we don't. But if you have ideas for doing that, please send us your ideas your way. And we're happy to have Peggy Mackey, one of the chapter authors, here as well. So thanks for joining us, Peggy. And then the second question is, because in many cases we are assessing student achievement of learning outcomes, what role, if any, do you think preparing marginalized students to meet learning outcomes, for example, teaching them metacognitive learning strategies, what role does that have in equitable assessment? Anybody want to jump in on that?
I'm happy to just start out a little bit, and that would, yeah, thank you so much. And this goes back more to the science of learning, that metacognition is a huge part among many other what typically get categorized as social and emotional learning. But emotions, we know from the science of learning, emotions play a role in students' ability to recall, retain, and then share what they've learned and developed. So all of that requires an equitable lens, just even in the structuring of the opportunity for students to be able to, so again, as mentioned in the last chapter, this book isn't meant to be a catch-all, but it covers a lot. But we need to also think about the design aspect of what precedes the conversation before assessment. And there are chapters that cover that, but this emotional part of learning is very integral in the equity conversation, and the assessment of it is as well. And this is where centering first person direct self-report is incredibly important, using the many ideas in the book.
Mm-hmm. Great, Mary Lee, thank you so much for that. And I would just add, one of the things that this parts of the book does is ask us to switch our lens in the ways that we ask questions. And so instead of saying, how are we preparing students to do this, it's how are we blocking the students from showing us the ways that they're already prepared? And in what ways are we privileging certain learning strategies over others that don't actually give us the good data that we need on what our students know and can do, because it's giving us how well can you do it in this very specific way that you didn't have a choice in choosing, and that has nothing to do with the ways in which and validate that. And so I think part of it is saying, where do we need to check ourselves and ask some of these questions? And that's a lot of that internal nice work and those pause and those reflections of, wait, let's think about, what is this structure perpetuating? And is it that it's about preparing certain students, or we need to rethink and reimagine the assessment process and how we validate and what types of learning counts in what ways to get to some of these spaces. But
yeah, and I'll just very briefly add that if you approach the work from an asset-based mentality and you implement culturally responsive practices, you ultimately get at these things, right? But yeah, kudos and second everything Natasha and Marilee just said.
And I'll build off of what Eric said. So there are ways in which we end up looking at students from a deficit perspective, right? There's deficit-based thinking. There's a whole body of literature out there about deficit thinking and the problematic ways that we unknowingly, unconsciously, unintentionally engage in. And so part of asking, marginalized students, do they need to be set up for success? It is if we are revisiting our processes and saying how are our processes setting them up for failure and pushing them out to exactly, and so I'm saying what Natasha said just in a slightly different way. We then check our processes and say, we need to have better student support. We can't play the blame game where, oh, those students are just not a good fit for our institution, or they just don't have the skills and they actually need to go somewhere and the schools didn't prepare them. If they have come to us and they are part of our education system, that act of love that we have, we are accountable to make sure that they are ready, that they are out there, they are thriving, and all of that, including their self-efficacy, a positive educational experience where they are not feeling like they lack something through the whole process. So all of that needs to happen on our end, while acknowledging, saying, okay, this is where these gaps are then perpetuating the student experience, and we need to address that. So I wanted to say that, and then I wanted to go back to that first question about restorative approaches, if I may. So Natasha had talked about this, and I want to emphasize this again. I don't think at least me as a chapter author and what I've read in all the chapters, this is not the be all and end all. This is just the beginning. There's there's such a body of work that's not represented. I kind of allude to that in my chapter, saying a lot of us here are very privileged in that we are able to write and be heard and be read, right? And there are lots of people who are doing like amazing work out there that's not necessarily captured in this book. And I want to draw the parallel with evaluation roots, right? There's a book called Evaluation Roots. It's a seminal work for anyone doing program evaluation theory. Like, that's the book to go to. And so there's a lot, they were looking at updating that book. And so a lot of evaluation folks in the social justice who are committed to social justice said, wait, like that's become such a seminal book, like revisit it and make sure we get the indigenous perspective, the indigenous roots, the women of color roots, like all of that. And it's the same thing over here. If you treat this book as a beginning for you to teach your students about equity, all of that, treat this as a beginning and go do more. I think that's what I wanted to say. So feel free to contribute, use this as a jump off point to do that.
Yes, and I just want to add, I love this conversation, and I'm sorry, Gavin's trying to rein us back in and answer another question. But I do just want to say that I think one lens to think about as you engage and read this book is that in the how section, while there are specific chapters that signal, like, think about this from STEM and think about this from student affairs, across the board, the practices that are talked about, and especially into thinking about some of the level setting and the different contexts, are applicable at a variety of levels. And so while you may want to say, okay, I want to see a specific chapter that says this in the title or the piece, or can you give me one of how do I do this in an accreditation report? The pieces are there. These are instances of spaces where we're doing a highlight of how to use it, but they are portable to a wide variety of other areas. And so I would say if there is something that you're thinking about specifically, and you're not seeing that word as you're looking through, that's okay, because there are pieces in there that will have implications for that work that you're doing. And that's also something that we wanted to be intentional about, is we want a wide variety of hows, but not trying to say we're capturing all the hows, because there's a lot of this that you can think about. What would it look like if we used the role of land differently and rolled that up in our program level? And there's the threads are there and the pieces are there. So we hope you take it and run with it.
Yeah. And the other thing I think it's important to note is that this book was written a few months ago. So, and the work in this field is evolving really, really quickly. So even after we submitted all the drafts back last fall, there's been a lot of work that's been happening in the months since then. So there's more and more resources that are coming out and becoming available. So we have a couple of questions that I think are kind of related about connecting identity, unearned and earned privilege, as well as exploring critical whiteness and privileged identities. I want to see, Marilee, if you can talk a little bit about how you all address that in your chapter.
Okay, and which question? I'm sorry, because I heard
it's okay. So
I apologize.
There are two questions regarding identity. So is there a difference between earned and unearned privilege. So do you talk about privilege in your chapter? And to what extent do you talk about critical whiteness or just exploring your privileged identities in doing this work?
Yes, yes. So the point of the chapter that we're offering is building off of everything that was said previously. But and you know, I'm seeing some of the chat come up about how social justice is a journey, how equity is a journey, and exploring privilege is also a journey, and the many facets of the ways that it comes through in the work that we do. So it's not enough to pause and notice. And this is why we're inviting in the questions for each step of where to take action. And just as a person wearing white skin who has many privileges, and also as a person with a disability, I've noticed an emergence of like a privilege, and the privilege shifts as Divya said, you know, thinking about the privilege of being able to write and to speak in this webinar. So the idea of this is it's not a snapshot. And I think I can't probably stress that enough, that while there are frameworks that we can offer and questions that we can posit, many of you likely have deeper, more thoughtful questions that you would add and invite your assessment team into exploring, and again, various rules that are coming into the webinar, but constantly asking and holding the question of how is privilege and power showing up in the way that I'm asking this question, or seeing this piece of data, or collecting this, or even silencing somebody's voice, or noticing a discomfort from a different perspective that's offered, or a challenge that's offered. That's the inner work of each person. And it's difficult to invite somebody else into that inner work. So our job, our invitation to readers of this book is to invite yourself into that inner work.
And I want to add too, because Dan asked if the very question was problematic. And I want to emphasize that no, those are the questions that we need to ask, right? As someone that is, and I'm Mexican, so I was born in Mexico, I'm an immigrant, but my skin is white, so I'm white passing, right? So that automatically gives me some unearned privileges just by how people judge me right off the bat. And I have a PhD after my name, so now I have avenues to talk to people and listen, right? So constantly questioning those, like Mary Lee said, having those conversations and asking that of others is the key to making sure that we're having that equitable mindset throughout.
And
Great.
it's about, and it's just about how we use our privilege, right? So earned, whether it's earned, privilege is often about, you know, that it's not earned. It's a function of the systems that set you up for success, that serve you. And so when we earn privilege, then we have a responsibility, you know, to pay it forward, which goes to that next question that someone asked, that we are able to lift people up and bring people along. So.
So we have a question from Bill. So how do you, the authors, talk about the inevitable pragmatic necessity of transitioning current assessment practice towards equitable paradigms? So if I understand that correctly, it's kind of about the why we need to do this and how do we do this. Eric, do you want to talk a little bit about that, our first chapter, and what we cover in that first chapter, like why we should be doing this?
Yeah, I think a lot of the underlying necessity for this is just the basic changing demographics, the enrollment of the country, right? It's no longer something that is off in the future, something that we need to do now. It's no longer a luxury. If we are to help students that are often at the margins, students that don't often get the same opportunities to advance educationally, then this is something that we have to implement intentionally, right? We hear more and more about how the workforce needs this, how the economy needs this, but our students need it, right? At the very foundation, our students themselves need it. So there's a lot of information and a lot of folks that did some of this work before us that we kind of stand on their shoulders and put it together. But it really is about that equity mentality, equity mindedness, and implementing that throughout the process, not just about using the data to inform equitable acts, right? Making sure that we're closing gaps, but also being equitable in the process itself, making it student-centered, really using the foundational pieces of how you're doing assessment and why to have the equity at the core of the process.
Thanks, Sarah.
If I could, I think there's
Yeah.
two other pieces that I just want to add in on this is one is thinking about part of also what we did in this book in the how section is you have this beautiful stop point on authors sharing the journey that they're on of putting this paradigm and moving this into work and seeing how do you get this into the educational system. So when you think about like, how do you do that? They're sharing like, here's how we did it. Here's where we are. Here's how far we got in that. Here's the challenges, you know, and it's this pause point where they could say, capture that as they're going. And there's different places in the different how chapters of how far they got or how much pushback they had or what it looks like or what they were able to maintain. And some too, you get the sense of like the fragility of it, of how, you know, the ground that's been covered, but how easy that could be to get lost. And so I think the how chapters just because of what they are beautiful examples and instances of that story and that journey. But if you think too about what are resources and points on this, one of the things that we try to do as editors is be very intentional about what research and citations are we pointing people towards? How are we thinking about the different voices that we're saying like, hey, this is something that you should read and should think about it and back up to start drawing those lines backwards to different foundations, to different thinking, to different other authors and different bodies of work that we normally don't turn to in some of our practice pieces. And so thinking too about how are we creating resource trails so that others can find pathways to different types of material, to different groups that they wouldn't have even thought about to go to that maybe don't seem like assessment related, but have huge implications for our practice. And so I think you have two ways in. One, we have the sort of the journey of those that shared, but then two, you have the exploration piece that you can be really enabled by because of how we thought about what research we want to point to, what citations we want to include, and how we want to be intentional about thinking about to whom do we turn to find more information on this.
Great, thanks, Natasha. So we have a question about, so Sarah is setting up a working book group at her institution and wants to know if we have any resources for facilitating conversations and will the video be available? I know Patty will talk about the availability of video. I don't think we have any. I'll ask the editors or authors if there are any resources for facilitating the conversation. I'm not sure if we have those, but I know we have tons of resources and we'd be happy to drop our email addresses in the chat. If you want to follow up with any of us individually, we can certainly share those resources for that conversation. Miriam asked about, she teaches high enrollment classes and struggled to balance equitable assessment and cheat resistant assessment. Does the book or the authors provide practical help on maintaining academic integrity and also equity, particularly in high stakes summative assessment? I'm not sure if we necessarily covered that. We certainly talked about the balance of equity-centered assessment practices and rigor, and when we talk a little bit about universal design for learning. And I think both Peggy's chapter on using technology really might help with those large classes because she has a great chapter on how to utilize some of the technology and learning management systems to do assessment in real time and be able to look at some of the inequitable opportunities either in the teaching and learning experience or even on assessments and assignments themselves. So I think that would be really helpful. And I'd also encourage you to take a look at Marianne Wickham-'s chapter on transparency because she talks a little bit about how to use some tools in doing that. And I think that might be helpful from almost more of a course design and course development perspective, where I think Peggy talks about it really more from the LMS perspective. So I think both of those might be helpful.
And Harriet Haas and Christine Robinson's chapter would be a good one as well, because of how they looked at assignments across and to figure out which ones make sense and work in different types of settings for large or small. And so that one would be a good one.
Yes. And then we have a question about the book addressed the importance of data disaggregation and techniques to advocate for it with senior leaders who may be more comfortable, familiar with traditional or census-based identity categories. I'll go ahead, Natasha.
I'm excited. So I would say Verna Orr, who is presenting somewhere else, but was maybe going to join us, and I don't think is able to come. She has a really nice chapter. She's talking from the perspective of HBCUs, but the ways in which HBCUs need to think about how are we judged, what are the metrics, and how do we push that conversation differently, I think is a really great like application of that question and ways to think about it. So I would take a look at Verna's chapter, and it's just a great chapter to read. I would read them all. That's what I would do.
Yeah, I think we easily talk about data disaggregation as probably a necessity. It should be one of the most basic elements of doing equity center assessment. I don't know if we talk specifically about how we talk to senior leaders about that, but hopefully there's some other takes from that. Let me see, so many questions and comments, lots of stuff in the chat. So I know Natasha will chime in if I'm missing anything. Does the book discuss the importance of language, the type that's used around assessment? If so, great. Can you talk about the language surrounding assessment as important? I think we get to some of the language pieces, I think, in the scholarship chapter, because we talk a little bit about the different terminology used, and we even break down those categories that I mentioned into more specific and nuanced elements and define some of those. Natasha, are there other things that you're thinking about?
I'm thinking about a chapter with Leslie where we get into narrative as well. And that's a big piece on language and how the ways in which we talk about this work, the stories we tell ourselves about this work, and how all of that impacts and engages. And Anne Lundquist and I also did a chapter on looking at the historical arc of our comfort level and use, and when we say we're doing equity work and assessment, and particularly kind of honing in on standardized tests and the language that's utilized around that has ripple effects and implications that play forward into how we embed that into our processes now. So yes on language, yes on narrative. Super good. Awesome. And here's the other thing I would just do a shout out, and other co-authors tell me if you're like, that's not good, Natasha, you're going too far. But one of the things that we really wanted to do with this book, and in terms of the get this into a conversation, is to say, if you are doing this, write about it and also get it out. And if there are ways that we need to think about how we can help assist and push and move these into different directions, we are happy to do so. Please feel free to use this as a resource to that. And the only other thing I had is resources. If you go to the Stylus webpage where the book is, there's a tab on resources, and you can find some resources that are there. So those will help you too. But I'm so excited you're all here and asking these great questions. Gavin, back to you.
And I love this idea of the book club. I'm glad folks are starting, and Aaron even started a Google form for folks. So check that out as well. And Stylus will be keeping the chat to send out with folks who registered, as well as the recording. So you can access the Google form there, as well as all the other people who expressed interest in that. Whew, I think we got through all the questions and most of the comments. Is there anything else that folks would like to ask before we pass it over to Patty to wrap up and give us some more information about how you can get the book at a discount?
I'll just add one quick thing. Sarah in the chat had asked a question, and I said I'll answer it. So Sarah and anyone else, the principles of universal design, like the idea that if you build a building and you make a ramp, it's not going to, make it harder for a student who is able to walk, climb up the stairs. It's not going to make it harder for them to enter the building, but it's going to make things that much easier for everybody, right? So that low end question, which is, so when you have resistance where folks say, oh, there's a low end, we can't make a decision. It's saying, if you are able to foundationally set something up so that the most historically marginalized, pushed out, consistently, systematically oppressed individual is able to thrive and succeed, everyone else who has privilege in the system is likely to succeed. It's not going to take away. It's not either or, it's, both and so that's one way. There's a lot of literature also, in terms of research studies that talk about this universal design you can point to, but that's just one quick thing. And to Sarah, Brene Brown's facilitation skills, conflict resolution. So some of that will help with facilitation. And the last thing about the technology and cheating, because in my other job, I work for a company that works so that I'm part of the Turnitin family and ExamSoft. And we talk about consistently, it's the human relationships. So are we approaching it from a punitive lens, or are we talking about it from a restorative lens? That's something that we should address to make it more equitable. So thank you.
Beautiful
Thanks,
points,
Divya.
Divya. And one of the things that I think is great about what you shared and showcased is the fact of the amount of partnerships that goes into doing this work. And so that this is not while there is individual work that we each need to do, this isn't an assessment professional, go forth and change all this on your own. And each of the different chapters and the examples and all things shared show how this is done in community with others, and that it is that collective. And so as you think about with whom do you need to facilitate and who do you need to bring in to help you engage in this process, and how do you need to think about partnering and to move this work in advance to get these points. And so thank you for your great comments as always.
So Natasha, any final comments before we have Patty wrap things up?
Just thank you for being here. Thank you for your interest. Thank you for the great questions and for engaging with us in this work. And thank you to all of the authors for going on the journey of writing this in such a difficult time. And when you think about two of the authors that we had, there's a social, emotional load and lift to do this. And we were so delighted to be in company with you on this process. So thank you.
Yeah. Divya, any final comment? Okay. And my final comment is
just find your community. Just find your community, find your people, and don't take things personally. We will make mistakes, and it'll be like, oh, I did that. I'm a yucky person, but go forward. Let's all go forward.
And my final comment is a thank you to Stylus for allowing us this opportunity, and specifically David Brightman for guiding us along the process. Thank you all for joining us. And Patty, to you.
All right. Thank you to all of our co-editors for sharing their time with us today, and to all of our chapter authors for joining us as well. And a big thank you to everyone who joined us live this afternoon on Zoom. If you are interested in ordering Reframing Assessment to Center Equity, use code RACE20 to get 20% off the book and free shipping from Stylus. I will share the link and code in the chat bar. Everyone will also get a follow-up email with the link and code, as well as a link to the webinar replay. Stylus posts all of our webinar replays on our YouTube account, so all of this will be available at any time starting Friday. The webinar calendar that we have is posted. If you want to check out any of our upcoming events in the fall, you can register via Zoom. And if you have any feedback on this webinar or any requests for future webinars, please feel free to email us directly at stylusinfo@styluspub.com. Thanks again.